Dan Crow died in 9 seconds. A burst steam pipe spewed superheated steam right into the compartment. His skin was the first to go. His lungs followed. The last thing he saw was the light from the emergency lamp above his head. The last thing he thought about was the letter to his daughter. He never finished writing the third paragraph. It was about how proud he was of her. Darkness came quickly and without pain. Or with pain, he couldn't tell anymore. Then there was nothing. No tunnel, no light, no voice. Just silence. And then a smell. Salty, heavy, as if someone had mixed iodine and cooled coal and splashed it right in his face. Dan opened his eyes. A wooden ceiling loomed above him. Not a ceiling, a keel. An unfinished ship's keel, crooked, asymmetrical, assembled in such a way that any first-year student at MIT would have cried with indignation. Dan was lying on a plank in a dimly lit room, a boathouse. He knew that word before he remembered his own name. The hands were someone else's, the same fingers, the same calluses on the fingertips. But the shirt wasn't his. Canvas, coarse. It smelled of someone else's sweat. He sat up, his head spun. A seagull was screeching outside, but it wasn't the right kind of seagull. The sound was too low, too guttural, as if half the bird's throat had been torn out and it had gotten used to it. People were arguing behind the wall. Dan didn't know their language, not a single word. Yet he understood every one of them. They were saying that the client wasn't paying, that the sea priestess would arrive in a month, that the ship wasn't ready, that they'd all be hanged. Dan stood up. He brushed the sawdust off his knees. He walked over to the keel. He ran his hand along the seam. Wood. Living wood. Soaked in something oily substance. A faint bluish light pulsed beneath the bark. He bent down. He looked along the keel line. The line wavered. A deviation of 3 fingers for every 2 meters. If this were launched, it would capsize at the first serious wave. Whoever designed this had clearly heard of ships, but they'd never built one. Dan straightened up. He took 3 steps back. He looked at the entire structure as a whole. The frames were uneven. The planking was laid with an overlap, but with varying overlap widths. The fasteners were wooden, not a single metal part, not a nail, not a staple. As if iron were forbidden here, or feared. The boathouse door creaked. An old man walked in, short, gaunt. His hands were dark with resin. His eyes were red. He looked at Dan the way one looks at a dead man who forgot to lie back down. Then he spoke. Dan understood every word, even though the language was foreign to him. The old man asked who he was and what he was doing at his shipyard. Dan answered. The words came on their own, in a language he'd never spoken before. He said he'd come to work, that he was a shipbuilder. The old man looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the keel. Then back at Dan. He said he had plenty of shipbuilders. What he lacked was money. What he lacked was time. He didn't have anyone who could explain to the Imperial Inspector why the order was 2 months behind schedule. Dan asked what kind of order it was. The old man explained. A coastal vessel for near-shore voyages, lightweight, fast, for transporting salt between ports. The client was from the capital. The deadline had passed. If the ship wasn't ready in 4 weeks, the old man would be executed for sabotaging Imperial supplies. Dan looked at the keel again. 4 weeks. With this. He ran his finger along the seam between 2 planks of the hull planking. The seam had come apart. The wood was soft, not properly dried. They'd used whatever they could find. The old man was watching him and waiting. Dan asked his name. Oscar Tide, Harrogatel's master shipbuilder. Harrogatel's last master shipbuilder. Dan nodded. He asked what kind of iron he had. Not magical iron, just plain, ordinary iron. Oscar frowned. He said that iron was forbidden, an imperial decree. Ships are built from wood and coral glue. Iron defiles the water. The sea priestesses can sense it from miles away. Dan said he didn't need much. A handful, an old nail, a scrap of chain, anything. Oscar said nothing. Then he turned and walked out. Dan was left alone. He walked back to the keel. He placed both palms on the wood. A bluish light flickered beneath his fingers. Warm. Alive. He'd never worked with material like this before, but he'd worked with wood, and with metal, and with steam, and with people who didn't believe they could succeed. That was his main craft. Half an hour later, Oscar returned. With him came a boy of about 15, skinny, red-headed, with a bandaged arm. They were carrying a sack. Inside the sack lay a pile of rusty junk, fragments of an anchor chain, bent nails, a piece of a plow, the tip of a grappling hook, all covered in a crust of rust and salt. Dan dumped it on the floor. He crouched down, sorted through every piece, picked up a fragment of the chain, tasted it. Soft iron, not cast iron. It'll do. He asked if there were any fire bricks. Oscar said they were taking apart the masonry in the old lighthouse on the shore. Dan said he needed 20 bricks, clay, coal, and one person who knew how to pump the bellows. The boy raised his healthy arm. Dan looked at him, asked his name. Thomas. Dan nodded. He said they'd need a furnace by morning, a small one, in the backyard. Thomas didn't understand why. Dan explained. They'd melt down this junk, clean out the slag, squeeze out the air, and get a piece of steel, real steel, from which he would forge a single part, just one, but that part would save the ship. Oscar asked what kind of part. Dan said a stem, a bow stem, forged, with the right angle, with the right shape, one that would cut through the water instead of pushing against it. Oscar said that was impossible, that an iron stem on a wooden ship was madness, that the priestesses would sense it. Dan replied that a priestess would sense a 3-metric-ton anchor, but from a distance, she wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a stem weighing 1.5 poods and a horseshoe on the shore. Oscar didn't believe him, but he didn't leave either. They worked all night. Dan built a furnace out of bricks and clay, a simple one, a crude one, the kind they made in Europe 500 years ago. No magic, no coral glue, just fire and air. Thomas pumped the bellows with his good arm. Oscar stood to the side and watched. By midnight, the furnace was hot. Dan loaded it with rusty iron. He added coal. He adjusted the draft. The flame turned white, then yellow, then white again. By the color of the sparks, Dan knew the smelting was going well. By 4 a.m, he pulled out the ingot, the size of a fist, gray, solid. He placed it on a rock and struck it with the back of an axe. The ingot rang out. It didn't split. It didn't dent. It rang out. Oscar stepped closer. Dan said it was steel. The old man reached out. He touched the ingot. It was still hot. He pulled his fingers back. But not because of a burn, because of surprise. The metal was smooth, solid, unlike anything he'd seen in 40 years of work. By dawn, Dan had forged the stem. Simple, elegant, at a 23-degree angle. He knew that angle by heart. He'd calculated such angles 1,000 times for other ships in another world. They dragged the stem into the boathouse, nailed it to the crooked keel. 4 nails made of the same steel. The stem fit perfectly, like a knife through butter. The keel was crooked. The planking was cracked and warped. The frames were loose, but the bow was now pointing the right way. Dan took 3 steps back. He looked. He nodded. He turned to Oscar. The old man was standing there, staring at the stem. His eyes were wet. His hands were at his sides. Dan said that now the ship would sail, not because it was all new, but because the bow was right. They'd rebuild the rest around it. Oscar didn't say anything. He just stood there and stared. Then he took off his cap. Then he put it back on. Then he took it off again. Thomas fell asleep right by the stove, his red head resting on the soot-stained brick. The first morning in the new world smelled of coal and hot metal. Dan sat down next to the boy. He closed his eyes and thought that since he was here, he had to build it right. In the morning, Dan woke up to a scream. A woman was screaming, loudly and angrily. He opened his eyes and saw that it wasn't the sun looming over him, but someone's shadow. Short, thin, with dark hair tied in a bun. She was looking down at him and saying something to Oscar. Dan made out the words. She was saying that his father had completely lost his mind, that he'd let a vagrant onto the shipyard, that the vagrant had built some kind of furnace in the yard and nearly burned down the shed, that if the Imperial inspector saw traces of smelting on the shipyard grounds, they'd be hanged not in a month, but in a week. Oscar remained silent. Dan stood up. He brushed off his hands. He looked at the woman. She was about 22, maybe 23. Her features were sharp. Her eyes were alert. Her hands were stained with ink. Not tar. Ink. He asked Oscar who she was. Oscar said she was his daughter, May Tide. May looked at Dan the way you look at someone who's climbed through a window into someone else's house. She asked who he was. Dan replied that he was a shipbuilder. She snorted. She said that shipbuilders don't sleep on the floor next to apprentices, and they don't build furnaces out of stolen lighthouse bricks. Dan didn't argue. Instead, he walked over to the keel and showed her the stem. May fell silent. She stepped closer. She bent down. She ran her finger along the edge of the metal. Then she straightened up. She looked at Dan with new eyes. She asked where he'd gotten such a pure ingot. Dan explained, briefly, without unnecessary words. Rusty iron, a blast furnace, high temperature, the slag separated, the metal remained. May listened. She didn't interrupt. Then she asked why exactly 23 degrees. Dan looked at her intently. It was a good question, the right question. The question of someone who thinks not about what was done, but about why it was done that way. He explained. The angle at which the stem enters the water determines the resistance. If it's too blunt, the ship runs into the wave. If it's too sharp, the bow plows into the water. 23 degrees is a compromise for a coastal vessel with a shallow draft and low speed. May nodded. Then she left. An hour later, she returned with a sheet of paper. On the sheet was a drawing, not just of the stem, but of the entire keel. The whole thing. A side view, top view, with dimensions, with deviation markings. She said she'd measured the entire hole last night after her father had fallen asleep. The deviations were worse than Dan had thought. The keel was off not only vertically, but also horizontally. The port side was 2 fingers higher than the starboard side. Dan took her drawing. He looked at it for a long time. The lines were straight, the dimensions were precise, the proportions were correct. This woman could draw better than half of his former colleagues. He asked why she didn't work at the shipyard. May pressed her lips together. She replied that women weren't supposed to. Dan said that it was up to him to decide who worked at the ship if he took on the job of finishing this ship. May looked at her father. Oscar was silent. Then he nodded. Once. Briefly. May didn't say anything, but the corner of her mouth twitched. She sat down next to Dan at the workbench, and they began to work. Dan was drafting a new plan for the ship, from scratch. He couldn't throw out the old hull. There was neither time nor money for that. But he could fix what was there, rearrange the frames, rework the planking, add an internal framework made of sturdier wood, and most importantly, implement a system of tolerances. He explained to May what a tolerance was. Every part can deviate from the dimensions on the drawing, but no more than a certain amount. If a part doesn't fit within the tolerance, it's remade. May asked what the tolerance was. Dan said that for a wooden ship, the tolerance is the thickness of a finger. For a steel one, half a fingernail. May wrote it down. 11 people were working at the shipyard. Oscar, May, Thomas, 8 other men of various ages and varying degrees of sobriety. Dan gathered them in the yard. He explained that he was taking charge of rebuilding the ship, that they had 4 weeks, that everyone would do what was written on their card. He handed out the cards. Each one listed the day's task: name, work area, and dimensions. Authorization. 3 men looked at their cards and asked what the point was. They already knew what to do. Dan replied that he knew. They would do exactly what was written. One of them threw his card on the ground. A big guy, bald, hands like logs. The local blacksmith. His name was Grant. Grant said he wouldn't take orders from a drifter, that the drifter didn't know the local wood, didn't know the local sea, didn't know the local rules, and that his steel was a fairground gimmick, not material for a ship. Dan didn't argue. He went to the boathouse. He brought back a scrap of steel stem, a small one, about the size of his palm. He placed it on Grant's anvil. Next to it, he laid a piece of the finest local iron. He handed Grant a hammer. "Hit it," he said. Grant struck the local iron. It dented and cracked. Then he struck the steel. The steel rang out. Not a dent, not a crack. Grant struck again, harder. The steel rang out louder. Grant stopped. He looked at the scrap. He looked at Dan. Silently, he took off his cap. He placed it on the anvil and said he was listening. The others gathered up the cards. Work began. The first week was hell. Dan slept 3 hours a night. He ate when May brought him a bowl of something hot. He remeasured every bulkhead, every plank, every joint. Half of it had to be taken apart and put back together. The men grumbled. Thomas was collapsing from exhaustion. Oscar looked at Dan the way one looks at a storm, with both respect and fear. On the 3rd day, May came to him with a question. She'd crossed out his drawing in white, every line, every dimension, and she found a discrepancy. The ballast Dan had calculated for the hold caused a list to starboard when fully loaded. 1/2 degree, a trifle. But with cross seas, it could turn into a problem. Dan took her drawing. He checked it. She was right. He recalculated. He shifted the ballast 20 centimeters to port. He looked at May. He told her she'd just saved the ship. May didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched again. By the end of the first week, the hull had been reworked. The frames were level. The plating was fitted. The tolerances were met. The ship wasn't ready yet, but it was already right. Dan stood on the pier that evening and looked out at the sea. The sea was dark, heavy. It smelled different from the Atlantic Ocean, deeper, older, as if the water here remembered something that people had long forgotten. A light flashed on the horizon, dim, greenish. It was coming from beneath the water. May stood beside him. She said they were the deep ones. They were coming closer and closer to the shore. 3 years ago, they had only been seen in the open sea. Now they're off the coast. Fishermen don't venture beyond the bay. The city is dying out. Dan asked what the deep ones were. May explained. Kraken, leviathans, coral hierarchs, sentient beings from the abyss. They had been sleeping for 1,000 years. 3 years ago, they awoke. Magical fleets are being destroyed one after another. The Empire calls this the tide of sorrow, and it prohibits any non-magical attempts to go out to sea under penalty of execution. Because if anyone proves that the ocean can be crossed without priestesses, the Empire's entire authority will collapse. Dan silently stared at the green light beneath the water. Then he asked how many people were left in the city. May said there were about 300 left. There had been 1,200. The rest had gone deeper into the mainland, or had died. Dan nodded. He turned toward the shipyard. He looked at the silhouette of the unfinished ship in the slipway, and he went to work. In the 2nd week, Dan ran into the main problem. The hull was sound, the keel was straight, the frames were in place, but the ship was still a wooden sailboat, and in this world, a sailboat without a priestess meant certain death beyond the bay. Dan had no intention of hoisting a sail. He was going to install a steam engine. A boiler required steel, a lot of steel. His blast furnace in the backyard produced 1 ingot per night. That was enough for nails and staples, but not for a boiler. A boiler is sheet metal, pipes, riveted seams, dozens of parts with the tolerance of half a nail. He sat at his workbench that evening and counted. May sat beside him, redrawing his scribbles into neat lines. Dan told her he needed iron, a lot of it, at least a metric ton. May replied that a metric ton of iron in Harrogate was worth more than the entire town. Dan asked, "What if we don't buy it? What if we find it?" May looked at him. She was silent for a moment. Then she said that there were 3 sunken ships at the bottom of the bay. One of them was an imperial vessel, with anchor chains, with iron grappling hooks, with copper sheet plating. It had sunk 8 years ago during a storm. The locals hadn't touched it because tampering with imperial property was punishable by death. Dan asked who would find out about this. May didn't answer, but the next morning she brought 4 divers from the port to the shore. Young, lean, hungry. They worked for 3 days, diving while holding their breath. The water was freezing. One of them cut his hand on a rusty edge. Dan stitched up the wound himself. Here, they did it worse than in the field. He remembered how, at the shipyard in Newport, the medical team would stitch up cuts in 5 minutes. Here, there was neither a medical team nor clean bandages. He gave her his shirt, teared it into strips, boiled them in seawater. May watched. She asked why he was boil it. Dan explained. Dirt in the wound causes infection. Boiling kills the dirt. May nodded and took notes. By the end of the 3rd day, a mountain of rusty metal lay on the shore. Anchor chains, pieces of plating, bolts, clamps, 1 intact cleat weighing 40 pounds. And the main find, copper sheets, thin, green with patina, but intact. Copper. Dan held a sheet in his hands and smiled. Copper isn't steel, but copper means tubes, and tubes mean a condenser, and a condenser is half a steam engine. He got the work underway. The furnace in the backyard was now burning around the clock. Thomas and another apprentice named Finn took turns pumping the bellows. Grant was forging. Dan showed him how to draw out a strip, how to bend a sheet, how to rivet an overlap. Grant was a quick learner. His hands were precise. It was just that no one had ever shown him what else he could do with metal besides hitting it with a hammer. At the same time, Dan was designing a boiler, the simplest kind, a fire tube boiler, 1 drum, 1 furnace, operating pressure no higher than 4 atmospheres. Even by 19th century standards, it was primitive. But here, it was a new law of physics. May looked at the boiler blueprint and didn't understand. Dan explained. Water heats up, it turns into steam. The steam pushes on the piston rotates the shaft turns the propeller, the ship moves. Without wind, without magic, without a priestess. May listened. She asked for clarification. She took notes. Then she asked a question Dan hadn't expected. She asked how much water the boiler needed, and how much coal, and how far the ship could go on a single load. That was an engineer's question, not a draftsman's, an engineer's. Dan did the math. With their coal, with their water, with a boiler of that size. 40 nautical miles, maybe 50. May said it was 70 miles from Harrogate to the nearest open port. Dan was silent. Then he said that meant they'd need 2 bunkers of coal, or better coal, or both. May nodded. In the 3rd week, what Dan had been waiting for and dreading happened. The priestess arrived. Naya Valente, a low-ranking sea priestess, assigned to the port as a supervisor. Dan saw her when she entered the shipyard grounds. Short, dark-skinned, dark hair pulled back into a tight braid, tattoos on her forearms, blue and green, a coral pattern, the symbol of the priestly order. She walked slowly. She was examining everything, sniffing around. Dan realized why. She could sense the iron. She didn't see it, she didn't hear it. She sensed it, like a smell or a vibration. Naya stopped by the blast furnace. She looked at it. She looked at Dan. She said she could sense metal, freshly smelted, on shipyard grounds. That was a violation of Imperial Decree No. 37. It was punishable by arrest and trial. Dan stood there looking at her. He saw her eyes, tired, not angry, tired. And something else. Wrinkles. Not for her age, she was 19, but the skin around her eyes was like that of a 40-year-old. The sea was eating away at her, literally. The priestesses paid with years of their lives for every spell, for every ritual, for every voyage. Naya might live to be 25, maybe 30, if she's lucky. Dan quietly asked how long she'd been asleep. She'd slept well, no nightmares. Naya fell silent. She hadn't expected that question. Then she said she didn't remember. Dan nodded. He said he wasn't asking her to turn a blind eye to the violation. He was only asking her to look at what he was building and then decide. Naya could have left. She could have filed a report. She could have called the Imperial Patrol. Instead, she followed him to the boathouse. Dan showed her the ship. He explained what he was doing. He explained why. Naya listened in silence. Then she asked just one thing. She asked if this ship would set sail without a priestess. Dan replied that it would. Naya stood there for another minute. She looked at the hull, at the steel rivets in the plating, at the blueprints on the walls. Then she turned and walked away. May approached Dan. She asked what to do now. Dan said he didn't know. They waited 3 days. No report came. There was no patrol. On the 4th day, Naya returned, alone, without her uniform, wearing simple canvas clothes. She was holding a bundle in her hands. She placed it on the workbench in front of Dan. She unwrapped it. A map. An old one. A detailed one. A map of the currents around Harrogate, with depth markings, with the routes of the deep ones, with safe passages known only to the priestesses. Dan looked at the map. He looked at Naya. She said her father had also been a shipbuilder before he was hanged for launching a boat with a copper keel. 15 years ago. Naya was 4 years old. She didn't become a priestess by calling. She became a priestess because orphans are given no other options. Dan took the map. He said thank you. Naya nodded and stayed. The 4th week was the last. An Imperial official would arrive in 7 days. If the ship wasn't in the water, Oscar would be executed. And perhaps not just Oscar. Dan was working. The boiler wasn't ready. The steam engine existed only on paper, but the ship could be launched without steam, for now. The main thing was to prove that it floated, that it stayed on course, that it didn't capsize. Dan focused on the hull. The planking was fitted. The caulking was packed in. The bottom was tarred. The rudder was mounted on steel hinges, which Grant had forged from the blueprint on his 3rd attempt. Dan had rejected the first 2. Grant cursed, but he remade them. May kept track of every seam. She started a notebook. In the notebook, next to each plank, there was a mark. Inspected, approved, signed. She came up with this herself. Dan saw the notebook and stopped. He looked at her. He said that this was called a quality control log, and that she had just reinvented it. May didn't understand what reinvented meant. Dan didn't bother to explain. Instead, he asked what she wanted to name the ship. May shrugged. She said it wasn't her business. The ship was custom built. The client would name it. Dan shook his head. He said he had another idea. Oscar had been working in silence these past few days. He was sawing, planing, fitting pieces together. He didn't argue. He didn't give orders. He just worked alongside everyone else. Dan noticed that the old man had started moving differently, more smoothly, more confidently. As if a crooked keel had been pressing down on his back, and now that weight had been lifted. On the 5th day of the 4th week, Dan gathered everyone together. 11 people, plus Naya, who came every evening and sat silently on the edge of the pier, plus the 4 divers who hadn't left and had started helping out at the shipyard. 16 people. Dan said that tomorrow they would launch the ship. Oscar asked about the sail. Dan said there wouldn't be a sail. There would be oars, for now. The ship will be launched. It'll sail to the end of the cove and back, with oars, so the official can see that the vessel floats. Oscar said that without a sail, it's not a ship, it's a barge. Dan replied that a barge that floats is better than a ship that sinks. May smiled, for the first time in all these weeks. She smiled genuinely, with her eyes, with the corners of her lips, and immediately looked away. The night before the launch, Dan worked alone. He walked around the hull, checking every seam, every rivet, every joint, with his hands, not his eyes. Hands can feel what the eyes cannot see. A micro crack, a rivet that wasn't driven in tight enough, a plank that would swell in the water and warp the one next to it. He walked along the side of the ship and talked to it, quietly, out of habit. He called it Sweetheart. He asked it to be patient. He said it would see the water soon, that the water here was strange but beautiful, that he'd do his best. May stood behind the bulkhead and listened. Dan didn't know she was there. She'd come to check her logbook entries and stopped. She listened as a grown man spoke to the wooden hull the way one speaks to a sick child. She stood there for 10 minutes, then she left. The morning of the launch was gray. Fog, light rain, a salty wind from the sea. The whole town had come out, all 300 people, old people, children, unemployed fishermen, merchants without goods, women in faded dresses. They stood on the pier and on the shore and watched. Dan stood at the bow of the ship beneath the steel stem they had forged on the first night. Oscar stood beside him. His hands were shaking, not from the cold. Dan placed his hand on Oscar's shoulder. He said one word. Ready. Oscar nodded. They removed the supports. The hull began to slide down the slipway, slowly, heavily. The wood creaked. It groaned as it slid along the lard-greased guides. The bow entered the water first. The stem sliced through the surface smoothly, like a knife. The hull settled onto the water. It rocked, to the left, to the right, and came to rest, level, without listing, without tipping over. Dan watched and counted the seconds. 5, 10, 15. The hull held steady. The waterline was exactly where he'd calculated it would be. Maybe a finger's width higher, but that was a minor detail. The ship was floating. The crowd was silent. Then someone shouted, and everyone cheered. Dan didn't hear what they were shouting. He was looking at the ship, at his ship, at the first ship he'd built in this world. Small, ugly, no mast, no deckhouse, essentially just a hole with a rudder. But it was floating. 8 men took their places at the oars. The ship set off, slowly, laboriously. The oars splashed as they entered the water, but it moved forward in a straight line. It didn't veer, it didn't list. The stem cut through the bay's gentle waves, leaving a smooth wake in its wake. Dan stood on the shore and watched. May stood beside him. Oscar was crying, for the second time in Dan's presence, but differently, completely different. The ship reached the end of the cove, turned around, came back. They beached it and tied it up. 2 hours later, an imperial official arrived. Not an inspector, an official. A minor one, fussy, with a ring on his little finger and papers in a leather briefcase. He inspected the ship. He felt the hull plating. He peered into the hold. He found steel rivets. He frowned. Dan stood nearby and explained, calmly, without haste. He said the rivets were made from recycled anchor iron, that it wasn't shipbuilding metal. It was fasteners, like nails. Imperial Decree 37 prohibits steel structural elements on ships. Rivets aren't structural, they're auxiliary. It was a lie. Every rivet was a structural one. But the official wasn't an engineer. He was a bureaucrat. Dan offered him some tea, the local kind, bitter, with salt instead of sugar. The official sipped his tea and listened as Dan explained that it was just a simple fishing boat with reinforced fastenings. Nothing new, nothing dangerous, nothing heretical. The official finished filling out the paperwork. He stamped it. He said the order had been accepted. That old man Tide was cleared of all charges, that the vessel was registered as a Class 3 coastal barge under a name to be chosen by the customer. Dan said the name was already decided. The official asked what it was. Dan said, Harrow. Abigail Morrow was standing in the crowd. She had come from her office at the port to watch the launch. She heard the name. She froze. Harrow. Her husband's last name, Captain Thomas Harrow, who had perished on the Magic Fleet's last voyage, 2 years ago. She looked at the ship's side where May had written the name in coal. Harrow. She stood there. She looked. Then she silently turned around and walked home. Dan saw it. May saw it. Oscar saw it. No one followed her. That evening, May brought Dan a bowl of fish soup. He was sitting at the workbench, looking at a boiler blueprint. May set the bowl down beside him. She paused. Then she asked how he knew about Abby's husband. Dan said Oscar had told him on the first day, when he was listing the townspeople, who was alive, who had died, who was left behind. May asked why he'd done that. Dan replied that the ship had to bear someone's name, the name of someone the sea had taken, so that the sea would know they were remembered. May was silent for a long time. Then she said it was beautiful. Dan replied that it wasn't beautiful. It's the right thing to do. The next morning, Abigail Morrow came to the shipyard, not in a morning dress, in a work skirt and with a ledger under her arm. She said that if the shipyard was going to operate, it needed an accounting department, because the way they were running things wasn't business, it was a disaster. Dan looked at her. Red hair, calluses from the ledger, dry eyes, calm. He said, "Welcome." A week had passed since the Harrow was launched. The ship was moored at the dock. It was afloat, but it wasn't running, because it had no engine. Dan was building the boiler, every day, from dawn till dusk. Grant was forging the plates, slowly, one at a time. Dan checked every plate personally. He tapped it with a hammer. He listened to the sound. A plate that sounded hollow went back into the furnace. A plate that rang went into production. At first, Grant was annoyed by the rejects. Then he got used to it. Then he began to hear the difference himself. May drew the blueprints. She redrew the boiler 4 times, each time more precisely, each time cleaner. Dan looked at her 4th version and realized she drew better than he did. His drawings were correct. Hers were both beautiful and correct at the same time. Those are different things. An engineer can read a correct drawing. Anyone can read a beautiful drawing. Thomas worked on copper tubes. Dan showed him how to draw copper through a stone die, a simple one, rough, 2 stones with a hole between them. You pull the blank through and it gets thinner, smoother. Thomas drew out tubes all day long. One arm was healthy, the other was bandaged, but he kept at it. By the end of the week, they had 30 copper tubes for the condenser. Nia came by every evening. She would sit on the edge of the pier. She would look out at the sea. She would be silent. Sometimes she would help. She would hand him tools. She would hold parts. Once, Dan asked her to hold a sheet of metal while he riveted it. Nia grabbed the edge and flinched. She let go. She looked at her hands. Dan asked what was wrong. Nia said the iron burned, not from the heat. It was something else, as if the metal were screaming. At her. Only at her. The priestesses felt iron as pain. It was part of their connection to the sea. The sea hated iron, and the priestesses hated it along with it. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he asked if she should wear gloves. Nia smiled. It was the first time she'd smiled in front of him. "It's sad," she said. "Gloves don't help. It's not through the skin. It's through everything." Dan remembered that. On the 3rd day after the descent, Dan assembled a boiler for the first time. A test version, a small one, about the size of a keg. The firebox was made of brick. The drum was made of riveted steel sheets. 3 copper tubes inside, 1 steam outlet. He poured in water. He lit a fire. He waited. May stood nearby. Oscar stood a little farther away. Grant stood even farther away. Thomas sat on the fence. Everyone was watching. 20 minutes later, the water came to a boil. 30 minutes later, steam began to escape from the outlet pipe, a thin, white stream. Dan held his palm up to it. It was hot, very hot. There was pressure, not much, but it was there. He turned the valve. The steam struck the side of the wooden box he'd placed in front of the pipe. The box shifted 3 fingers width. May looked at the box. She looked at the boiler. She looked at Dan. She asked if this was what he was going to use to move the ship. Dan nodded. May was silent for a moment. Then she said that the box had moved 3 fingers width, and the ship weighs 20 metric tons. Dan smiled. He said that this was a test model. The real boiler would be 10 times bigger, and the pressure will be 5 times higher, and the steam won't go into the box, but into a piston, and the piston will turn the shaft, and the shaft will turn the propeller. May asked what a propeller was. Dan explained. Blades, underwater, on a shaft. When the shaft spins, the blades push the water backward. The ship moves forward, without oars, without a sail, without magic. May was taking notes. Dan watched her hand move, quickly, confidently. She wasn't just writing down words, she was drawing. A diagram of the propeller, with blades, with the angle of inclination, based on his description. Based on a single verbal description, she had drawn a working sketch of a propeller. Dan fell silent. He looked at the drawing. The blade angle was wrong, too steep, but she'd captured the idea exactly. He took her charcoal stick, corrected the angle, and explained why. May nodded and corrected the entire drawing in 2 minutes. Meanwhile, Abigail was dealing with money, or rather the lack thereof. The shipyard was bankrupt. Oscar kept no books. Money came and went. No one knew how much a plank cost, how much a nail cost, or how much a journeyman's day's work was worth. In 3 days, Abby compiled a complete inventory, the shipyard's assets, materials in stock, debts, revenue. The results were grim. The shipyard could hold out for another 2 months, then the money would run out completely. She went to Dan with these figures. Dan looked at them. He asked, "What if the Harrow starts carrying cargo?" Abby said that a coastal vessel without a sail and without a priestess wouldn't get a license. Dan said that the Harrow was afloat, that it was registered, that it had an official seal, and the paperwork didn't specify how it was supposed to move, only that it had to deliver cargo from point A to point B. Abby looked at him. Then she opened her ledger. She reread the papers and smiled. For the first time, she'd found a loophole. The imperial law on coastal shipping did not specify a requirement for the type of propulsion. Sails, oars, rowers pulling on a rope, anything. The law only stated that the vessel must be registered and have a licensed captain. Abby had a license. She was the captain's widow, and under imperial law, a widow inherited her husband's license. Abby had never used it because she didn't have a ship. Now she did. Dan said Abby would be the captain of the Harrow. Abby said she was an accountant, not a captain. Dan replied that she was both. A week later, the Harrow set out on its first coastal voyage, without steam, under oars. 8 men rowed. Abby stood at the stern with a map, Nina's map, marked with currents and depths. The cargo was simple: salt, 10 barrels, from Harrogate to Low March Harbor, 20 miles along the coast. They went all day. The rowers were exhausted by the halfway point, but they made it. They delivered the salt. They got paid. Not much, but it was their first pay. Real money, actual coins. Abby brought them to the shipyard and laid them on the table in front of Oscar. The old man looked at the coins, then at Abby, then at Dan. Meanwhile, Dan was sitting in the boathouse, cursing at the test boiler. The seam had sprung a leak. Water was seeping from the joint between 2 sheets of metal. He couldn't keep the pressure above 2 atmospheres. He couldn't hold it. He needed better riveting, or a different way to join them. Dan thought. May sat next to him and was thinking too. She asked, "What if we coat the seam with the same compound they use to caulk the plating?" Dan looked at her. He thought. The caulk wouldn't withstand the temperature, but the idea was right. They needed a sealant that could withstand the heat. He remembered, an asbestos gasket. But there was no asbestos here. Or maybe there was. He asked Oscar if there was any white stone in the area, soft, fibrous, and non-flammable. Oscar thought for a moment. He said that in the mountains north of Harrogate there was a quarry where they mined soft white stone for stove linings. They called it stone wool. Stone wool. Dan almost laughed. Asbestos. They called it stone wool. He sent Thomas and Finn to the mountains. 2 days later, they brought back a sack, white fibrous clumps. Dan soaked them, kneaded them, mixed them with clay and vegetable oil. He made a putty. He smeared it over the boiler seam. Let it dry. Lit a fire. The pressure rose. 2 atmospheres. 3, 4. The seam held. May stood nearby and counted. Dan stood nearby and listened. The boiler hummed, steadily. No whistling, no knocking, just humming, as if it were alive. Dan placed his palm on the steel side. Hot. He said quietly, "Well, there you go, a cutie." "Now you're working." May heard him. She didn't say anything, but she wrote it down in her notebook. Boiler number 1, test successful. Operating pressure 4 atmospheres. The weld is airtight. And in the margins, in small handwriting, she added, "He talks to machines." A month had passed since the Harrow set out on its maiden voyage. During that time, it had made 4 more trips, all by oars, all along the coast. Salt outbound, grain on the return, dried fish outbound, cloth on the return. The profits were small, but they were there. Abby kept the books. Every coin accounted for, every expense recorded. Dan looked at her ledger and thought this woman was worth an entire accounting firm. The shipyard was breathing. It wasn't alive yet, but it was breathing. For the first time in 6 months, Oscar paid the apprentices. Not in full, but he paid. Thomas bought himself a new pair of boots. Finn took the money to his mother. Grant said nothing, but that evening Dan saw him standing by the anvil, stroking it with his palm, as if telling it that everything would be all right. Dan understood him. He himself talked to the boiler that way. Boiler number 2 was no longer a prototype, the real thing, full size, fire tube, with a drum made of 6 riveted sheets, with 12 copper tubes in a bundle, with a firebox designed for local coal, which was lousy, brown, damp. It gave off little heat and a lot of smoke. Dan recalculated the heating surface area 3 times. He increased the number of tubes to 18. May redrew everything in white. By this point, she wasn't just copying anymore. She was reading the drawing. She understood what every line meant. She asked why the tubes were arranged exactly that way. Dan explained. Hot gases from the furnace flow through the tubes. The water outside the tubes heats up. The more tubes there are, the greater the contact area. The faster the steam forms. May asked, "What if we make the tubes thinner and use more of them?" Dan paused. He looked at her. She had just described the principle of the Babcock and Wilcox multi-tube boiler, in her own words, without a single textbook. He said she was right. But thin tubes are harder to make, and they burn through faster. You need a balance. May nodded and wrote it down. Balance. She wrote that word down often. At the same time, Dan was building a steam engine, the simplest kind, a single-cylinder engine, piston, rod, crank, flywheel. He made the piston 3 times. The first one split during testing. The second got stuck in the cylinder because Grant had gone overboard with the diameter. The third fit just right. Dan stood over the cylinder and listened to the piston moving. Up, down, smoothly, no knocking, no sticking. He closed his eyes. In the darkness, it sounded like breathing, steady, mechanical, alive. In the 3rd week of the 2nd month, disaster struck. They were hoisting the boiler into the Harrow hull through the top hatch. The boiler weighed 400 pounds. The hoists were made of wood. The ropes were hemp. 4 men were pulling. Dan stood below, directing them. The rope snapped. The boiler swayed. One of the scaffolding's crossbeams cracked and collapsed. Finn was standing right beneath it. May screamed. Dan rushed forward. He didn't make it in time. The beam fell on Finn's leg. The crunch could be heard throughout the shipyard. Finn screamed. Then he fell silent. He lost consciousness from the pain. Dan dropped to his knees. He looked. A fracture, an open one. The bone was sticking out of his shin. Blood, a lot of it. May was standing nearby, pale, her hands pressed to her mouth. Dan told her to bring a clean cloth, boiled water, 2 straight sticks for a splint. May ran off. Dan pressed down on the wound. His hands were covered in blood, warm, sticky. He remembered the accident at the shipyard in Newport, 7 years ago. A crane beam had fallen. 2 people had died. 1 had lost an arm. After that, he'd written 10 pages of safety regulations, which the bosses had put in a drawer and forgotten about. There were no bosses here. It was just him. He applied a splint, bandaged the wound. They carried Finn to Oscar's house. May sat by the injured man's side all night, changing his bandages. Dan didn't sleep either, but not by Finn's bedside. He sat at the workbench and wrote, until morning. In the morning, he gathered everyone together, 16 people, minus Finn, 15. He placed a stack of sheets in front of them. The shipyard's work rules, 22 points. He read them aloud, slowly, each point separately. First, no one stands under a load, ever, under no circumstances. Second, scaffolding is inspected every morning. Every beam is checked by hand. If it wobbles, replace it. Third, ropes must be checked before every lift for break strength. Fourth, work near hot metal only while wearing leather gloves. Fifth, there must always be a bucket of water next to the furnace. He read all 22 points. The men listened. Some exchanged glances. Some nodded. Grant listened without moving. When Dan finished, Grant asked one thing. Why hadn't he said this before? Dan replied that he thought they already knew. Grant said they didn't know. That people here are taught how to work, but not how to survive. Dan posted the rules on the boathouse wall. May wrote them out in large letters on the blackboard. Every single point, so that even the illiterate could ask to have them read aloud. Finn's recovery took a long time, 6 weeks. His leg healed crooked. He limped for the rest of his life. Dan saw him every day, and every day he remembered that it was his fault. He hadn't checked the scaffolding. He hadn't checked the ropes. He'd been busy with the boiler, and he'd forgotten that the boiler weighed 400 pounds, and people are fragile. May saw how he was tormenting himself. One evening, she told him that Finn was alive, that his leg would heal, that he was already walking with a cane and complaining that they wouldn't let him near the furnace. Dan said nothing. May added that before Dan, there were no rules at the shipyard. No one thought about safety. That Finn's accident was the first in 6 months. Before, there used to be 3 a month. It's just that no one kept track. Dan nodded, but it didn't make him feel any better. He knew it would only get easier once the boiler was back in place and the Harrow was running on its own. And that's what happened. At the end of the 3rd month, they hoisted the boiler into the hull, using new hoists, with new ropes, with inspected scaffolding. 4 men up top, 2 down below. Dan guided the lift. Grant provided backup. May stood with a plumb line, making sure it was vertical. The boiler settled onto the foundation. Level. Dan connected the steam engine. The shaft passed through a gland in the bottom and emerged outside. Dan attached a propeller to the end of the shaft. 4 blades, made of forged steel. Grant spent 2 days making each blade. Dan checked the angle with a wooden template. They filled it with water. They lit the fire. They waited. May counted the minutes. Oscar stood on the shore, not at the shipyard, on the shore. He couldn't bear to watch up close. The pressure rose. 1 atmosphere, 2, 3. At 4, Dan opened the steam relief valve. Steam rushed into the cylinder. The piston jerked. It rose. It jerked again. And it moved. Up, down, up, down. The shaft began to turn, slowly, heavily. The propeller beneath the stern churned the water. The harrow trembled. The rope tightened. Dan listened. The knock of the piston, the rumble of the boiler, the splash of water astern. Steady, rhythmic, working. He looked at May. May was watching the rotating shaft, her eyes wide open. She was seeing this for the first time. The mechanism that moved the ship, without wind, without a current, without magic, without a priestess. Just fire and water and steel. Dan untied the rope. The harrow set off, on its own, slowly. 3 knots, maybe 4. Smoke from the funnel drifted across the water, black, thick, ugly. But the harrow was moving, against the wind, against the current, forward. Oscar was standing on the pier, and Naya, and Abby, and Thomas, and Grant, and everyone else. No one was shouting. Everyone was silent. They watched as a small, ugly ship with a smokestack sailed across the bay on its own, the first in the history of this world. Word spread quickly. A ship sailing without a sail and without a priestess, smoking like a chimney, roaring like a beast. But it was moving, against the wind, in a straight line, without stopping. The fishermen from the neighboring villages were the first to arrive. They stood on the shore. They watched. They crossed themselves in their own way. Then they left. Then they came back, with their wives, with their children. They watched again. A week later, a merchant from Lomarsh arrived. He was fat, sweaty, with a purse on his belt. He asked how much it would cost to transport goods on this contraption. Abby named her price. The merchant haggled. Abby didn't budge. The merchant paid. The harrow made the trip to Lomarsh in 4 hours. By oars, that journey took a full day. The merchant looked at his watch, at the ship, at Abby. He asked if he could book regular trips. Abby said yes. The money started coming in, not a lot, but it was steady. Dan calculated coal consumption. He recalculated. He optimized the air supply to the furnace. He adjusted the size of the grates. With each voyage, the harrow sailed a little more efficiently than the last. May recorded the results: coal consumption per mile, speed at different pressures, boiler warm-up time. She started a separate notebook. She called it the Engine Room Logbook. Dan saw the title and smiled. In his world, such logbooks had been kept for hundreds of years. Here, May had come up with the idea herself. In the second week after the first steam voyage, what Dan had been waiting for happened. And an inspector arrived. Not a bureaucrat like last time. A real inspector. A military man, in uniform, with 2 soldiers. His name was Lieutenant Brax. Young, neat, cold eyes. He didn't drink tea. He inspected the harrow from keel to funnel. He went down to the engine room. He looked at the boiler, at the cylinder, at the piston, at the propeller shaft. He looked for a long time. Then he went up on deck and asked Dan who had given him permission to build it. Dan replied that no permission was required. The coastal vessel was registered. It had a seal. The type of propulsion was not specified in imperial law. Brax looked at him for a long time. Then he took a scroll out of his bag. He unrolled it. He read it aloud. Imperial Admiralty Decree No. 114.7, prohibiting the use of mechanical propulsion systems on sea and river vessels without the approval of the Maritime Council. Signed 2 days ago. Dan said nothing. 2 days ago. They'd drafted the decree specifically for this in just 2 days, as soon as the rumor reached the capital. Brax said that the harrow must be decommissioned, the boiler dismantled, the blueprints confiscated. Dan asked what would happen to the crew and the shipyard. Brax replied that for now, nothing, but if Dan tried to set sail in that vessel again, He'd be arrested for violating decree number 114.7. Brax left. He left a single soldier on the pier. The soldier sat on a barrel, looking bored. Dan stood in the boathouse, staring at the wall where May's blueprints hung. The boiler, the engine, the propeller, the shaft. She had signed each sheet at the bottom in small handwriting. May Tide, draftsman at the Harrogate shipyard. Abby came to see him an hour later. She asked what to do. Dan said nothing. For now. He was thinking. May arrived 10 minutes after Abby. She asked the same thing. Dan told her to sit down. He sat down himself. He was silent for a moment. Then he said that the decree prohibited mechanical propulsion at sea and on rivers. May nodded. Dan asked, "What about the bay?" May looked at him. "Harrogate Bay isn't the sea. Technically, it's a bay, an enclosed body of water. No imperial law classified Harrogate Bay as a sea or a river. It was a harbor. Harbors were managed by local authorities, and the local authority in Harrogate was the city council, which consisted of 3 people. Oscar Tide, the harbor master, who had left a year ago and never returned, and Abigail Morrow, as the captain's widow, who had a vote on harbor matters. 2 votes out of 3. Dan looked at May. May looked at Abby. Abby opened the ledger. She found the section on harbor regulations. She read for 10 minutes. Then she looked up. She said Dan was right. The bay didn't fall under the jurisdiction of the Admiralty. It was an inland harbor, and the city council had the authority to permit any type of vessel within its boundaries. Dan said they needed a council meeting, today. Abby said that she and Oscar were the council, and that a quorum was 2 out of 3 people. The meeting took place in Abby's harbor office. Abby and Oscar sat at the table. Dan stood nearby. May sat in the corner and took the minutes. Oscar voted in favor. Abby voted in favor. The decision was unanimous. Steam-powered vessels are permitted in the waters of Harrogate Bay. The minutes were signed. The seal was affixed. Abby personally delivered a copy of the minutes to the soldier on the pier. The soldier read it. He didn't understand. He sent a dispatch to Brax. Brax returned 3 days later. He read the minutes. He turned red with anger. But legally there was nothing he could do. A bay was a bay. The council was the council. The law was the law. Brax said it wouldn't last long, that the capital would issue a new decree, one that would plug this loophole as well. He left. The soldier left with him. Dan watched them go. Then he turned to Abby. He said they had time, a little, maybe a month, maybe 2. During that time, they had to make sure that closing the harbor would cost the Empire more than leaving everything as it was. Abby asked how. Dan said they needed clients, lots of them, from different ports, merchants who would pay for fast delivery, who would complain to their representatives if Harrow were shut down, who would create political pressure. Abby nodded. She understood. Dan wasn't talking about ships. He was talking about money and power. And he was right. For the next 6 weeks, the Harrow worked non-stop. Trips around the bay, short, fast. They picked up cargo at the dock, took it to the far end of the bay. There they transferred it to wagons. The wagons went to Lowmarch, or to Craigport, or to Marshhaven. Technically, the Harrow didn't go out to sea. He sailed around the bay. But the cargo was delivered faster than it would have been by wagon directly, because the roads were muddy and rutted, and the bay was smooth and calm. Merchants valued time. Time was money. Within a month, Harrow had 14 regular customers. Within 6 weeks, 22. The money went to the shipyard. Dan hired 8 more workers. He expanded the blacksmith shop. He built a second furnace, bigger, more powerful, and no longer a blast furnace, but a shaft furnace, with a taller pile of coal, with forced draft from a water wheel. This furnace produced not just 1 ingot per night, but 3, and the quality of the steel was higher. He began preparing the blanks for a new ship. Soyeon Khan appeared in Harrogate at the beginning of the 6th month. Dan didn't know who she was. No one did. She had come on foot from the north, along the mountain road, alone. She was wearing men's pants, a leather jacket, boots worn down to the soles, a bag on her back, a knife on her belt. The bag contained tools, not carpentry tools, not blacksmith's tools, artillery tools, calipers, barrel templates, a set of drill bits, a small lever press for percussion caps, and a notebook filled with small, neat handwriting with drawings of cannons. She had come to the shipyard. She stood by the gate. She was looking around. Dan noticed her when he came out of the boathouse. He asked if he could help. So-yoon took one of her caliber gauges out of the bag, a bronze one, precise, with markings Dan recognized, not the local system of measurement, the Khanate's, metric, closer to the metric system than anything he'd seen in this world. She said she'd heard about a ship sailing without a priestess, that she'd come to take a look. Dan asked where she was from. So-yoon said she was from the Khanate of Dongbek, that she had worked on the Khan's magical ships. She designed weapons against krakens. Dan asked why she had left. So-yoon paused. She took out a pipe, packed it, lit it. The smoke was bitter and acrid. Then she said that the Khan was selling technology, not to other states, to a cult, an abyssal cult that feeds the deep ones. She saw it. Documents, correspondence, blueprints that were sent not to arsenals, but to underwater temples. Weapons against krakens were being sent to those who awakened the krakens. She tried to report it. Her superior turned out to be part of the chain. She was given a choice: keep quiet and live, or speak up and die. She chose a third option. She fled, took her tools, destroyed what she could, and headed west. 3 months on foot. Across the steppes, across the mountains, past 2 border posts. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he asked only one thing: what she could do. So-yeon smiled. She pulled a notebook out of her bag. She opened it. A blueprint for a breech-loading gun, with a rifled barrel, with a wedge-shaped breech block, with calculations for the projectile's muzzle velocity. Dan stared at the blueprint for a long time. Then he looked up. So-yeon met his gaze. She said she knew how to shoot, and she knew how to make the things they shoot with. Dan took her to the shipyard. Not everyone was happy about it. May was wary, a woman with guns, from an enemy nation, with a backstory that couldn't be verified. Abby was more practical. She asked if So-yeon could pay for her room. So-yeon pulled a handful of Han coins from her bag, gold ones. Abby counted them. She said it would be enough for half a year, and that there was a vacant room above the office. Oscar looked at So-yeon and said nothing. Naya was silent too, but for a different reason. She sensed something in So-yeon. Not iron. Something else. Gunpowder. The priestesses sensed gunpowder just as they sensed iron, as a scent, as a vibration, as a scream. Naya approached Dan that evening. She said that this woman smelled of death, not figuratively, literally. Her hands are soaked in gunpowder, every pore of her skin, every fingernail. She's fired so many shots that the gunpowder has become part of her body. Dan asked if that was a problem. Naya paused. She said she didn't know. Dan said he needed someone who knew how to build guns, because when the Empire sent not an inspector but ships, he'd need something to fight back with. Naya looked at him. She said he was going to war. Dan shook his head. He said he was going to build, but build in such a way that no one would dare to destroy it. So-yeon got to work. She and Dan clashed on the very first day. She wanted to install large-caliber smoothbore cannons. According to Khan tradition, close range, large projectiles, maximum damage. Dan wanted rifled barrels, small caliber, long barrel, accuracy at long range. They argued for 3 hours. So-yeon smoked her pipe and poked at the blueprint with her finger. Dan stood at the board and drew trajectories with charcoal. May sat in the corner and wrote down the arguments of both sides, in separate columns. When the argument reached an impasse, May raised her hand. Both looked at her. May said that there were 7 arguments in Dan's column and 7 in So-yeon's. But 3 of Soyeon's arguments refute 3 of Dan's arguments, and 2 of Dan's arguments refute 2 of Soyeon's arguments. So it's 4-4, a tie. They needed a compromise. Dan looked at Soyeon. Soyeon looked at Dan. Soyeon was the first to laugh, briefly, sharply, like a dog barking. Then she said, "All right." A compromise, a rifled barrel, medium caliber. They sat down side by side and began sketching together. May redrew it from scratch. 3 hands, 3 handwriting styles, 1 drawing. The first drawing Dan signed with 2 names, Daniel Crow and Soyeon Han. May saw the signatures and asked, "What about me?" Dan looked at her. Then he picked up a piece of charcoal and added a 3rd name, May Tide. Because without her drawings, this project wouldn't exist. May didn't say anything, but her hand, the one holding the charcoal, trembled. Just a tiny bit. At the same time, Dan was thinking about the new ship. The Harrow was a proof of concept. Small, slow, wooden with steel rivets, for coastal navigation, but not for the ocean. For the ocean, a different ship was needed. Steel, armored, with a powerful engine, with guns, with a coal supply for 1,000 miles. A battleship. He began drawing at night, when everyone was asleep, alone in the boathouse by the light of an oil lamp. May would find him in the morning, asleep on his drawings, with a piece of coal on his cheek. She would gather the sheets, smooth them out, redrew them neatly, filed them in a folder. She called the folder Project M. Dan asked why M. May said it was the first letter of a word she hadn't thought of yet. Dan nodded. He didn't say that he already had a name, Mayflower, but he'd say it later, when the time came. Lady Clarissa Ashton Vale arrived in Harrogate in her 6th month. Not on foot, in a carriage, with a coat of arms on the door, with 2 trunks of belongings, with a maid who, upon seeing the shipyard, turned around and drove back. Clarissa stayed. She stood on the pier in a silk traveling dress and elbow-length gloves. She looked at Harrow, at the smokestack, at the piles of coal, at the dirty men in work clothes, at May, who came out of the boathouse with blueprints in her hands and stopped at the sight of the aristocrat. Clarissa was the youngest daughter of Admiral Ashton Vale, commander of the Imperial Western Fleet, one of the most influential men in the Empire. Clarissa had publicly questioned her father's naval doctrine at a reception in the presence of 2 dukes and a representative of the Naval Council. She said that the doctrine was outdated, that magical ships were being lost because they were poorly designed, not because the deep ones had grown stronger, that the fleet needed reform, not prayers. Her father sent her to Harrogate for her upbringing, in other words, into exile, far from the capital, far from receptions, far from disgrace. Dan didn't learn all this from her. He learned it from Abby, who read the Imperial newspapers 3 weeks late and followed politics as closely as she did the books. Abby said that the presence of the Admiral's daughter in H. Arrogate was both a gift and a curse. A gift because her name protected her from petty bureaucrats. A curse because she was surely being watched. Dan nodded. He went over to introduce himself. Clarissa spoke to him in an icy tone. She called him Mr. Crow. She said she'd been assigned a room in town and that she intended to stay here as long as it took for her father to cool off. No longer. Dan asked what she wanted to do. Clarissa looked at him the way one looks at a servant who has forgotten her place. She said she wasn't going to do anything. She wasn't here of her own free will. Dan said, "All right," and left. 3 days later, Clarissa went to the shipyard, just to look around. 5 days later, she went again. She stood off to the side. She watched Grant forge a sheet of metal. She watched May draw. She watched Thomas draw out copper tubes with one hand. On the 7th day, she approached May. She asked what May was drawing. May showed her a blueprint for a new furnace, a shaft furnace, for smelting larger volumes. Clarissa looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she said she'd seen a similar design at the Imperial foundries, only bigger, 10 times bigger. May asked how she knew about the foundries. Clarissa paused. Then she said that before she was exiled, she had spent 3 months at the Valentine shipyards. She was studying shipbuilding, not because she was allowed to, because she went on her own, dressed as a man, with a forged pass. She wanted to understand why her father's ships were sinking. May looked at her with new eyes. On the 8th day, Clarissa took off her gloves. Her left hand was disfigured. Her fingers were twisted, immobile. The skin was tight with scars. A childhood injury. She was 6. She fell off a horse. Her hand was shattered by the stirrup. The doctors saved her hand, but not its mobility. 30 years in a glove. For 30 years her left hand had been dead. She never showed it to anyone. Never. Clarissa took off her gloves and began pulling out the rivets with her right hand. She pressed her left hand against her body, but she kept pulling them out. May offered to help her. Clarissa refused, sharply. May wasn't offended. She just kept working beside her. Dan watched. He didn't interfere. After 2 weeks, Clarissa knew the names of all the workers. After 3, she began helping Abby with the paperwork. It turned out that the aristocrat knew imperial law better than any lawyer in the port city. She found 4 more loopholes in the legislation that protected the shipyard from imperial claims. Abby was delighted. Quiet, practical. She told Dan that Lady Clarissa was worth 10 lawyers. Dan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about her hand. At night, he sat in the boathouse and sketched. Not a ship, not a boiler, not a cannon. A hand. A mechanical hand. 4 fingers, a thumb, hinges, springs, cables connected to the muscles of her forearm. The idea was simple. The remnants of the muscles in her forearm still worked. She could tense and relax them. If thin steel cables were attached to those muscles, and the cables were run through a system of hinges, then the dead fingers would move. Not like real ones, clumsily, slowly, but they would move. He sketched until dawn. May found him in the morning. She looked at the sketch. She was silent for a long time. Then she asked who it was for. Dan didn't answer. May looked at the sketch again, at the dimensions, at the proportions of the hand. A woman's hand, the left one. She understood. She didn't say anything. She traced over it in white and put it in a separate folder. She wrote, "Untitled," on the folder. Chapter 10. At the same time, Dan was building. The new furnace was up and running, a shaft furnace, with a water blast. It produced 3 ingots per night. Grant had mastered rolling, primitive rolling, 2 stone rollers, a red-hot ingot between them. The result was a strip, rough, uneven, but a strip nonetheless. From the strip, he could bend sheet metal. From the sheet metal, he could rivet the plating, steel plating. Dan did the math. For the battleship's hull, he needed about 800 sheets. At 3 ingots a night and 1 sheet per ingot, that's 800 nights, a little over 2 years. Too long. He needed a blast furnace, a real one that smelt not pounds, but tons. He began designing a blast furnace on the shore of the bay near the shipyard. He needed stone for the foundation, fire bricks for the lining, clay, sand, and ore. There was bog ore. In the vicinity of Harrogate, it was mined for local needs, but not enough. The blast furnace would need 100 times more. Dan sent Thomas to scout the area. Thomas returned 3 days later. 20 miles north of the city lay a bog, a large one, and there was enough ore there to last 10 years. But the bog belonged to the imperial crown. Mining without permission meant stealing from the empire. Abby said there was a workaround, the law on unclaimed resources. If the land had not been used by the crown for 5 years, the local council could declare the resource unclaimed and begin mining it. The swamp hadn't been mined for at least 20 years. Clarissa checked the records. She confirmed it. The last entry regarding the swamp war dated back 30 years. The city council convened again. Oscar and Abby. They voted, unanimously. The swamp war was declared ownerless. The mining rights were transferred to the Harrogate shipyard. Dan understood that this was a temporary measure, that the Empire would protest, that a new decree would come, or a new inspector, or no inspector at all. But for now it worked, and every day that it worked brought him closer to the blast furnace, to steel, to the battleship, to the ocean. The blast furnace had grown over 2 months. Dan built it the way a fortress is built, a foundation of hewn stone, walls of 3 layers of brick, an inner lining of fireclay brought down from the mountains, 4 sagens high. By local standards, it was a tower. People from town came to look. They stood on the shore. They pointed. Some crossed themselves. Some spat over their shoulders. Some brought their children. The children stared with their mouths agape. Grant worked on the masonry, silently, straight as an arrow. He'd learned to lay bricks along a string line with a tolerance of half a finger. Dan checked every row. After a week, he stopped checking. Grant laid them straighter than Dan himself. Thomas led a crew of 4 new workers, guys from neighboring villages. They'd come for food and a paycheck. They stayed because Thomas knew how to explain things, simply, clearly, without unnecessary words. Dan noticed this. He told Thomas that he was the foreman. Thomas blushed. He asked what that meant. Dan explained. It meant he was responsible for his 4 workers, for their work, for their safety, for making sure they knew what they were doing and why. Thomas nodded. That evening, Dan saw him standing by the rules posted on the wall, reading all 22 points, syllable by syllable, moving his lips, memorizing them. Dan would remember the day the blast furnace was lit for the rest of his life. It was a clear morning. The wind was blowing in from the sea. It was cold. The whole shipyard had gathered, 26 people. Oscar, May, Grant, Thomas, Finn with his cane, Soyan with his pipe, Clarissa without gloves, Naya at the edge of the pier, Abby with the ledger, and 17 workers who, over those months, had become not just employees but a team. Dan stood by the loading chute, a shovel in his hands. He loaded the first batch of ore and coal himself, then the second, then the third. The water wheel spun the bellows. Air rushed into the furnace. The fire roared up. The temperature rose. 1 hour, 2, 3. At the 4th hour, the first cast iron flowed from the spout. White, red hot, blinding. It flowed into an earthen trough and solidified into a heavy gray ingot. Grant watched this stream and couldn't take his eyes off it. In 40 years of blacksmithing, he had never seen so much molten metal at once. Dan didn't stop at cast iron. Cast iron was brittle. The ship's hull needed steel. He knew how to turn cast iron into steel. The Bessemer process, the simplest, blowing air through it. The carbon burns off. Cast iron becomes steel. This required a converter. Dan built it in a week, out of fire bricks and iron hoops. Simple. Rough. It looked like an upside-down bell with holes in the bottom. Air from the bellows flowed through the holes. They carried out the first smelting at night. Dan loaded the cast iron ingots. He turned on the blast. Sparks flew upward. A pillar of fire rose above the converter. Orange, then white, then orange again. Dan watched the color, the shape of the sparks, the sound. When the sparks became small and frequent, he realized the carbon had burned out. He shouted, "Stop!" The bellows were stopped. The converter was tilted. Steel flowed out of it. Not cast iron. Steel. Liquid. Dazzling. Alive. It filled the molds. It solidified. Dan waited an hour. Then he picked up a hammer. He struck the ingot. The ingot rang out. Clear. Even. Without a crack. No cracks. Grant stood nearby. He took off his cap, put it on, took it off again. It had become a habit of his whenever he was around things he couldn't explain. The blast furnace changed everything. In the first month of operation, they smelted more steel than the entire open hearth furnace had produced in half a year. Dan began building up a stock of sheets for the battleship. Grant trained 2 apprentices in rolling. He put 3 more to work on riveting. The shipyard was no longer the old shipbuilder's workshop. It was becoming a factory, a small one, dirty, noisy, but a factory. Something else happened that same month. Hana Ryu, 17 years old, an orphan, a waitress at a harbor tavern. She'd ended up at the shipyard because they fed her there. Dan didn't pay any attention to her for the first 2 weeks. She brought water, she swept up shavings, sometimes she handed him tools. Quiet, unobtrusive, skinny as a stick. Then this happened. Dan was calculating the converter load. He needed to know how much cast iron to load in order to get the right weight of steel at the output. Blowing losses amounted to about 14%. He was doing the math on paper for a long time, in a column, with mistakes and corrections. Hana stood nearby, waiting with a bucket of water. When he finished writing the number, she quietly said it was wrong. Dan looked up. He looked at her. She gave the correct number, a different one, 3 pounds more. Dan recalculated. She was right. He asked how she'd figured it out. Hana shrugged. She said she'd just calculated it in her head. Dan wrote another problem on the paper, a harder one. 3 numbers, multiplication, division. Hana answered in 5 seconds. Correct. Dan wrote another one, with fractions. Hana answered in 10 seconds. Correct. Dan placed a piece of charcoal on the paper. He looked at her. He asked who had taught her to count. Hana said no one, that she'd always counted that way, that the numbers were like pictures in her head. She sees them, and she sees what happens to them when they're added or multiplied, as if they move on their own. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he asked if she knew how to read. Hana shook her head. She didn't. No one had taught her. Dan said that starting tomorrow, he would teach her to read, to write, and a few other things. May took on the task of teaching her to read, every evening, after work, by lamplight. May pointed out the letters. Hana memorized them quickly. In 3 days, she was reading syllables. In a week, whole words. In 2 weeks, she could read a simple blueprint. Not the lines. She understood the lines right away. The numbers in the margins, the dimensions, tolerances. She read the blueprint the way others read a book, fluently, without hesitation. Dan gave her a ballistic table, the one he and Soyun had compiled for the rifled weapon. The table correlated the barrel's elevation angle with the projectile's range at different charges. Hana looked at it. She ran her finger down the columns. She paused. She said there was a mistake in the 3rd row. The range at a 20-degree angle and a 1.5-pound charge should be 1,180 yards, not 1,200. Because with that charge, the muzzle velocity is 4% lower than calculated due to barrel losses, which they had noted earlier in the table. Dan and Soyun exchanged glances. Soyun took a long drag on her pipe. She looked at Hana. She looked at the table. She recalculated. 1,182. Hana had rounded it correctly. Soyun silently held out her hand to her. Hana shook it. The server's thin, dirty fingers in the artillerywoman's rough palm. Dan saw this and thought that for this moment alone, it was worth dying in a steam pipe and waking up in a world where an orphan girl could calculate in her head faster than a grown man with an MTI degree. He gave Hana a job at the shipyard, not as a supply clerk, as a navigator, the world's first female navigator. She didn't know what that meant yet, but she would know, soon. That evening, Dan sat on the pier. Naya sat beside him. They were silent. They looked out at the sea. The green light underwater was closer than it had been a month ago. Naya said the deep ones were approaching, that she could hear them every night. That before it had been a distant noise, like the surf. Now they were voices. They were calling. Not her. All the priestesses. Calling them to return. To the sea. To the bottom. She said that soon she wouldn't be able to sleep at all. Dan was silent. Then he asked if the iron helped. Naya looked at him. Dan explained. Iron blocks magic. The priestesses can sense it, so iron blocks the connection. If she surrounded herself with iron, on all sides, walls, ceiling, floor, maybe then the voices would fall silent. Naya was silent for a long time. Then she said quietly that it hurt. Iron caused her physical pain, like a burn. but the voices caused worse pain. Dan nodded. He said he'd think about it. He thought about it all night. By morning, he had a rough sketch. A cabin, small, 2 by 2 meters. Walls made of double steel sheets with an air gap, steel floor, steel ceiling, steel door, wood paneling on the inside, so that Naya wouldn't touch the metal directly. The air gap and the wood were supposed to soften the pain caused by the proximity of the iron, but the steel cocoon was supposed to drown out the voices. He didn't know if it would work, but he had to try. He showed the sketch to May. May looked at it. She looked at him. She asked who it was for. Dan said it was for Naya. May was silent for a moment. Then, without a word, she crossed it out in white. She signed her name at the bottom. The Cabin of Silence. The keel of the Mayflower was laid on the first day of the 10th month. Dan stood in the dry dock and watched as Grant, along with 4 apprentices, laid the first steel beam. Heavy, straight, cast in their own blast furnace, rolled on their own mill, cut to May's specifications. The beam settled onto the foundation cells with a dull thud. Dan placed his palm on the metal, still warm from the sun, smooth. He closed his eyes. For a second, it seemed to him that he was standing in the dry dock at the Newport News shipyard, that he would turn around at any moment and see the crane beams, the floodlights, the welding torches, people in hard hats. But he opened his eyes and saw May with a charcoal pencil tucked behind her ear, Grant in his leather apron, Thomas with his foreman's stick, Soyeon with a pipe clenched between his teeth, Hanu with his notebook of calculations, Oscar, who stood off to the side and gazed at the steel keel the way a man looks at a miracle he never believed in. It was a different world, and these were his people. The Mayflower was being built faster than Dan had anticipated. The blast furnace was running 3 shifts. The converter produced steel every 2 days. Grant had already trained 6 rollers. The sheets came out smooth. Riveting proceeded without delays. May had developed a numbering system for the parts. Every sheet, every bulkhead, every rivet had a number. The number indicated where the part belonged, in which row, on which side, at what height from the keel. At first, the workers complained about all the extra paperwork. Then they understood. When Thomas mixed up 2 plating sheets, the numbers allowed them to find the mistake in 10 minutes. Without the numbers, they would have spent half a day looking for it. Soyeon was building the guns, 2 rifled barrels of medium caliber, one at the bow, one at the stern. She cast the barrels in earthen molds. She drilled them out by hand. She cut the rifling with a homemade lathe that she and Dan had assembled from a water wheel and a bronze cutter. Each barrel took 3 weeks. Soyeon worked in silence, intently. She smoked her pipe. She cursed in 3 languages when the chisel got dull. Dan stood nearby and handed her tools. Sometimes they worked in silence for 6 hours straight, without speaking, just knowing what the other was doing. By the end of the first barrel, Dan realized that Soyeon worked just like he did, with her hands, her eyes, her ears. She listened to the metal. She sensed when the chisel was moving correctly, when to stop, when to change the angle. She was an engineer, a real one, not by a diploma, but by her hands. One evening, after 10 hours of work on the second barrel, they sat by the stove, tired, silent. Soyeon was smoking. Dan stared into the fire. Soyeon said this was the first gun she'd ever made that wasn't meant to kill. Dan looked at her. She explained. In the Khanate, she'd designed cannons to fight krakens, but the krakens were stirred up by the very people who ordered the cannons. A circle. A vicious one. She'd been making weapons that created a demand for themselves. Here, it was different. Here, the cannons were needed to protect what they were building, not to destroy what someone else had created. Dan nodded. He said there were 2 names on the blueprint, hers and his, and that she would fire the first shell herself. Soyeon looked at him for a long time. Then she turned away, took a drag on her pipe, and nodded silently. At the same time, the first real threat arrived. Not an inspector, not a decree. A man. Commander Reginald Salt. head of the Order of the Salt Key, the Empire's secret police, specializing in heretical technicians. He didn't arrive in uniform, in plain clothes, alone, no soldiers. It was worse than if he'd brought a regiment. Salt walked into the shipyard as if he were strolling along the waterfront. He looked at the blast furnace, at the dry dock, at the Mayflower's hull, at the smokestacks, at the workers. He stood there for a moment. Then he left, without saying a word. Abby found out who he was through her contacts at the Port Authority. She came to Dan, white as a sheet. She said the Order of the Salt Key was no joke. These were the people who had burned down shipyards. They sank ships. They hanged shipbuilders. Over the past 20 years, they'd destroyed 11 attempts to build a non-magical fleet. Not a single one made it to the launch. Dan listened. He was silent for a moment. Then he said they wouldn't stop. Abby asked how he planned to defend himself against a man who had the right to execute without trial. Dan replied that he didn't know. Not yet. That night, he lay on the workbench and thought. Salt hadn't brought any soldiers. That meant he was still assessing the situation, gathering information, making a decision. If he decides to destroy the shipyard, he'll come with fire. If he decides it can be put to use, he'll come with a proposal. Dan was betting on the latter, because Salt had come alone. A man who wants to burn things doesn't come alone. He comes with torches. 3 days later, Salt came again. This time he spoke up. He asked to see the Harrow's engine room. Dan showed him. Salt looked at the boiler, at the piston, at the propeller shaft. He touched the parts. He asked questions, smart questions, technical ones. How many atmospheres? What's the coal consumption? What's the speed? What's the range? Dan answered, honestly, without downplaying anything. Salt listened. Then he asked the most important question. He asked if this ship could go out into the open ocean, cross it, without a priestess. Dan replied that this one couldn't, but the one being built in the dry dock would be able to. Salt nodded. He was silent for a moment. Then he said that such a ship would destroy the Empire, that the monopoly on priestesses was the only thing keeping the three powers from a war of all against all, that if anyone could cross the ocean without a priestess, chaos would ensue. Dan replied that chaos had already begun, that the deep ones are awakening, that magical fleets are perishing, that there aren't enough priestesses, that the coasts are emptying, that the Empire's monopoly is based not on strength, but on fear, and that the fear is ending. Salt was silent. He looked at Dan. Then he said he'd be back, and he left. Dan knew this wasn't the end. This was the beginning. For the next 4 months, Dan built. Every day. No days off, no breaks. The Mayflower grew in the dry dock like a living creature. The frames went up first, the ship's steel ribs, 26 of them, each curved to a template, each inspected by May person. Then the plating, sheet by sheet, rivet by rivet. Grant led a crew of 12 riveters. The pounding of hammers never ceased from dawn to dusk, rhythmic, steady, like a heartbeat. May became the chief engineer, not because Dan appointed her, because it turned out that way. She knew every drawing, every dimension, every tolerance. When a worker came with a question, he didn't go to Dan, he went to May, because May answered faster, more accurately, and she didn't swear. Dan swore. Not at people, at circumstances, at bad coal, at warped blanks, at the rain that was flooding the dry dock. May didn't swear. She solved problems. Dan saw this and realized that the Mayflower hadn't been his ship for a long time. It was theirs, both of theirs. But if it belonged to anyone more than anyone else, it belonged to May. Dan designed a completely different steam engine for the Mayflower, a 2-cylinder engine with a compound expansion cycle. The steam first worked in a small, high-pressure cylinder, then moved to a large, low-pressure cylinder. 2 expansion stages. More work from the same amount of steam. Less coal consumption. Greater range. May spent 2 weeks drafting the engine. She redrew it 4 times. On the 5th attempt, Dan looked at the drawing and didn't correct a single thing, for the first time ever. May looked up. Dan nodded. He said the drawing was approved. May didn't say anything, but that evening, for the first time, she signed the drawing with more than just her name. May Tide, chief designer, on her own, without permission. Dan saw the signature the next morning. He smiled, and didn't change a thing. They built the quiet cabin for Nia inside the Mayflower's hull, right in the center, between two bulkheads, double steel walls, a 3-finger-wide air gap, interior paneling of dry oak, a steel door on the outside and a wooden one on the inside. Mia stood in front of the cabin, hesitating to enter. Dan stood beside her. He didn't rush her. Nia took a step, then another, a third. She stepped inside. The walls closed in around her, steel on all sides. She shuddered, tense, waiting for the pain. The pain was there, dull, like a toothache, but bearable. The wood softened it. The air gap dampened it. And most importantly, the voices. The voices of the deep ones that hadn't let her sleep for 3 years, that had been calling her to the bottom, that had been eating away at her life, bit by bit. The voices fell silent. They didn't just fade away, they fell silent, completely, for the first time in 5 years. Nia stood in the cabin and listened to the silence. Real silence. Complete silence. Absolute. Then her legs gave way and she sat down on the floor. She pulled her knees up to her chest, and she cried. Silently. Just tears streaming down her cheeks. Dan stood behind the door. He heard her. He didn't come in. He'd finished the prosthesis for Clarissa in the 13th month. A hand made of thin steel, 4 fingers on hinges, the thumb on a separate hinge, springs made of hardened wire, cables of twisted copper, a forearm attachment made of leather straps. Grant made the hinges, each one the size of a pea. Fine jewelry work for a blacksmith who was used to striking an anvil with a sledgehammer. But Grant managed it, because Dan explained why. And for the first time in his life, Grant worked not with a hammer, but with tweezers. Clarissa didn't know about the prosthesis. No one had told her. Dan had asked everyone to keep it a secret. That evening, he called her into the workshop, just the two of them. He placed the prosthesis on the workbench. Clarissa looked at it, at the steel fingers, the hinges, the cables. She didn't understand. Or maybe she didn't want to understand. Dan explained. The prosthesis attaches to the forearm. The cables connect to the muscles that still work. When she tenses her forearm, the cables pull the fingers. The fingers bend. When she relaxes, the springs extend them back. Not like a real hand, clumsy, slow, but she'll be able to hold things, squeeze, grab. Clarissa was silent. Dan put the prosthesis on her arm. He tightened the straps, adjusted the fasteners. "Try it," he said. Clarissa tensed her forearm. The steel fingers twitched. They clenched. Not all of them. 3 out of 4. The thumb wouldn't move. Dan adjusted the cable. He told her to try again. Clarissa tensed her arm once more. All 4 fingers clenched. Her thumb closed around her index finger. Clarissa stared at her left hand, at the steel fingers that were moving for the first time in 30 years. She raised her hand, turned it, looked at it, clenched it, unclenched it, clenched it again. She picked up a pencil from the table. She held it. She didn't drop it. She held it. Dan stood and watched. Clarissa put the pencil down. She looked at Dan. Her eyes were dry. Her face was stony, as always. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Crow." Her voice was steady, not a single tremor. Then she turned and walked out. Dan heard her reach the back room. He heard the door close. He heard the silence behind the door shatter. He stood there listening as Lady Clarissa Ashton Vale cried for the first time in her life. And he pretended not to hear. The Mayflower was launched at the end of the 18th month. It was a foggy morning, gray. a light drizzle. All of Harrogate stood on the shore. Not 300 people like a year ago. 500. People had returned. Because there was work in town. There was food. There was a shipyard that paid wages. There was a school. Dan had opened it in the 14th month for the workers' children. May taught drafting. Hannah taught arithmetic. A 17-year-old girl who, a year and a half ago, couldn't read was now teaching children to count. And the children were counting. The ship stood in the dry dock, ready. A steel hull, 200 feet long, 32 feet wide. An armored belt at the waterline. 2 guns, one at the bow and one at the stern. A double steam engine. 2 boilers. Coal bunkers for a 1,000-mile range. A tall funnel, straight, black. The Mayflower was not a pretty ship. Bulky, angular, not a single curve for the sake of beauty. Every line was subservient to function. Every plate was positioned to support. Every rivet was driven in to keep the water out. Dan stood at the bow and looked. Everyone stood nearby. May, Soyan, Clarissa, Naya, Hannah, Abby, Oscar, Grant, Thomas. All 38 shipyard workers. Dan didn't give a speech. He simply said that the ship was ready, that its name was the Mayflower. May stood beside him. She didn't know. She hadn't guessed. Dan turned to her. He said he'd named the ship in her honor, because without her, this ship wouldn't exist. Because she'd found the error in his first calculation. Because she'd redrawn every sheet. Because she'd become a designer, even though they'd told her women weren't supposed to. May stood there. She looked at him, then at the ship, then at the name on the hull. Mayflower. Her mouth twitched. Her eyes glistened. She didn't say anything. She just nodded. Once. Oscar stood behind her. The old man was crying, openly, without shame. The third time with Dan, and the most important one. They removed the supports. The Mayflower crept along the slipway, heavily, slowly. The steel hull scraped against the guides. The bow entered the water. A wave rose. The hull settled on the surface. It rocked. It stood upright, level. Dan was counting. The waterline matched the calculated one, down to a finger's width. May was counting beside him. Their numbers matched. The Mayflower was afloat. They fired up the boilers. An hour later, the pressure reached operating level. Dan opened the valve. The engine started up. The double knock of the pistons, steady, powerful. The shaft began to turn. The propeller churned the water behind the stern. The Mayflower set off. She made her way through the bay. 3 knots, 5, 7, 9. Dan stood in the engine room and listened. The rumble of the boilers, the thud of the pistons, the hull's vibration. Everything was working. Everything they had built with their own hands from rusty junk and swamp ore and hungry nights. Everything was working. He went up on deck. The Mayflower was sailing out of the bay. Against the wind. Against the current. Smoke trailed behind the stern. People were shouting on the pier. Dan didn't hear them. He was looking at the horizon, at the ocean beyond the bay's mouth, at the water that had belonged to the deep ones for 1,000 years. 3 weeks later, Salt arrived. This time he wasn't alone. 12 men were with him, soldiers of the order, and an order. To arrest Daniel Crow, to confiscate the ship, to destroy the shipyard, signed personally by the Imperial Chancellor. Dan was standing on the deck of the Mayflower when Salt came aboard. Salt handed him the order. Dan read it. He looked at Salt. He asked what he thought. Salt paused. Then he said he thought the same as before, that this ship would destroy the Empire. But he added something new. He said the Empire had already been destroyed, because in the 3 months he'd been in the capital, 2 more magical fleets had been lost. 17 ships, 4,000 people, 8 priestesses, and that the Admiralty had chalked it up to the tide of sorrow, to the will of the gods, to inevitability, and that he, Salt, no longer believed in inevitability. Because he'd seen how steel holds back water, and how people build without magic. Dan asked what he was proposing. Salt said he was proposing a deal. He wouldn't carry out the order. He'd tell the capital that the shipyard had been destroyed. But in return, Dan had to show him what Soyan had found, what she'd brought back from the Khanate. Evidence that someone was feeding the Deep Ones. Dan looked at Soyan. Soyan was standing by the gun. Her hand was on the barrel. The muzzle was clenched between her teeth. She nodded. Dan turned to Salt. "Let's go," he said. They went down to Soyan's cabin. She opened her notebook. She showed him the documents she'd brought out of the Khanate. Correspondence between Khanate generals and the abyssal cult. Blueprints of devices that were dropped into deep water faults. The devices emitted a sound of a specific frequency. This sound awakened the Deep Ones. It guided them. It told them where to swim, whom to drown. Salt read. His face was stony. His hands were motionless. When he finished, he looked up. He asked who was behind it all. Soyan said that in the Khanate it was the generals, but they were receiving instructions from somewhere in the center, from the capital of the empire. Salt turned pale. Dan said the source wasn't at the bottom. It was on land, in the very heart of Valicine. Salt was silent for a long time. Then he stood up. He said he would destroy the arrest order, that he would return to the capital, and that he would start searching. But if Dan turned out to be right and the conspiracy originated from the throne, then Salt would need more than just a ship. He would need a fleet. Dan nodded. He said there would be a fleet. Salt left. 12 soldiers left with him. Not a single one looked back. Dan stood on the deck and watched them go. May approached. She asked what would happen now. Dan said that now they would set sail. The battle in Harrogate Bay took place a week after Salt left. 3 Imperial magic ships, giant ones, glowing with coral, alive in a way that Dan never quite understood. Their hulls pulsed with blue light. Their sails were woven from something that moved of its own accord. On each one stood a sea priestess, arms raised, eyes closed, mouths open in a silent scream. They were steering the ships with their very lives, literally. Every mile cost them a year. Nia stood on the deck of the Mayflower and watched them. Her face was pale. Her hands were pressed against her temples. She could hear them, even through the steel bulkheads. 3 priestesses were screaming inside her head, calling her to return, calling her to cast aside the iron, calling her to the sea, to the depths, to the one who sleeps. Dan placed a hand on her shoulder. He whispered, "Go to your cabin." Nia shook her head. She said she would stay, that she had to see. Dan didn't argue. He went down to the engine room. That was where he belonged, by the boilers, by the speaking tube, by the pressure gauges. The Mayflower sailed out of the bay to meet the Imperial fleet. 1 ship against 3. Not yet fully completed, with half the armor on the upper deck missing, with half the crew. 32 people on board, against 300. Fog lay over the water like a blanket, thick, white. The Imperial ships couldn't see the Mayflower. Their priestesses couldn't sense it. The steel was invisible to the magic of the sea. For the first time in 1,000 years, something had set sail into the ocean that the Deep Ones could not sense. Soyan stood by the bow gun, her hands on the aiming mechanism, her eyes narrowed. The pipe was extinguished and tucked into her pocket. She waited. Hannah stood on the navigation bridge. Before her lay a notebook with calculations, a map of Ni, a compass, a ruler. She was calculating in her head, distance, speed, angle, wind, current, all at once. Clarissa stood on the upper deck. Her left hand, in a steel prosthesis, clutched a signal flag. In her right hand, a spyglass. She was the first to spot the flagship. She raised the flag. Red. Enemy on course. Abby was below deck, in the infirmary, which was a tiny room with 3 cots and a box of bandages. She was preparing to receive the wounded, friends and foes alike. May was in the hold, near the hull. She listened to the ship's breathing, the groaning of the bulkheads, the creaking of the rivets. She knew every seam, every plate, every weak spot. If the hull started to crack, she'd be the first to hear it. Dan stood by the speaking tube. He gave the order. Full speed ahead. The engine roared. The Mayflower surged forward, through the fog, silently. Only the rumble of the engine and the lapping of the water. The Imperial's first volley vanished into the mist. They were firing blindly. Their magic couldn't see its target. The shells landed in the water 100 yards from the Mayflower. Pillars of water rose and crashed back down. The hull rocked. The second volley missed as well, even further off. The priestesses on the Imperial ships were scrambling about. They were screaming. They didn't understand what was happening. The sea was silent. The enemy was invisible. Dan gave the order to Soyan. Fire. Soyan aimed the barrel. Hannah shouted the correction. 2 degrees to the right, half a degree up. Soyan adjusted her aim. She fired. A thunderous roar tore through the fog. The recoil pushed the Mayflower backward. The shell flew through the fog and struck the flagship's mast. The mast snapped. It crashed onto the deck. The coral light on board the flagship flicked on and went out. The priestess on the bridge fell. A second shot. Hannah recalculated. A new adjustment. Soyan fired the stern gun. The shell struck the waterline of the second ship. It pierced the hull. Water gushed inside. The ship began to list. The third Imperial ship turned around. It tried to flee. Clarissa raised a signal flag, white with a red cross. Surrender or sink. The flagship was sinking slowly. The coral light faded deck by deck. A priestess on the second ship was kneeling and crying. Her ship was dying beneath her, literally. Magical ships were alive, and when they sank, the priestesses felt their death. Naya stood on the deck of the Mayflower and, for the first time in her life, could not hear the sea. The steel bulkheads behind her cut everything off. Voices, screams, prayers. She stood in silence, and it was the happiest silence of her life. The third ship lowered its flag. The battle was over. Abby was tending to the wounded, 2 of her own. Shrapnel wounds from wooden splinters. 14 strangers who had been pulled from the water. She bandaged them just as she would her own. No difference, because a wounded person is a wounded person. May climbed out of the hold, covered in soot. Her hands were greasy. Her hair was plastered to her forehead. She walked over to Dan. He was standing by the speaking tube, exhausted. May said one thing. "It's holding up. The hull is holding up. Not a single leak. Not a single burst seam. Not a single torn-off rivet. The hull is holding up." Dan looked at her soot-stained face, at her oil-stained hands, at her eyes, in which something burned that he didn't know the name of. He said, "Thank you for building this with me." Clarissa came down from the upper deck. Her steel prosthesis gripped the spyglass. She heard his words. For the first time in her life, she didn't reply in an icy tone. She said, "You're the one who built this for us." The sun was rising on the horizon. The fog was lifting. For the first time in 1,000 years, not a single priestly prayer could be heard over the ocean. Only the blast of a steam whistle. Dan leaned on the speaking tube. He closed his eyes and said quietly, addressing no one in particular, "Daughter, I think I've finally finished the letter." 2 years had passed since that morning when Dan Crow opened his eyes in a strange boathouse. In those 2 years, the dying port of Harrogate had transformed into the coast's first industrial city. The blast furnace operated non-stop. A second blast furnace was under construction nearby. The rolling mill was producing sheet metal. The shipyard had laid the keel for a second battleship. The school had expanded from 1 room to 3. May taught drafting. Hannah taught arithmetic and navigation. Clarissa taught imperial law and history. The workers' children learned to read blueprints before they learned the alphabet. Dan thought this was right. Technical drawing is a language that feeds you. The Mayflower made its first transoceanic voyage 20 months after its launch, across the open ocean, without a priestess, without magic, without prayers. Only coal, steam, steel, and 32 people who believed they would make it. The deep ones came on the third day. Dan was standing in the engine room when the hull shuddered. Something enormous passed under the keel. Naya ran out of the quiet cabin. Her eyes were wild. She said it was a leviathan. Big, very big. It didn't attack. It swam past and left, because it couldn't sense them. The steel hull was ate to the magic of the deep ones. They saw the wave, they saw the foam, but they didn't see the ship. The Mayflower was a ghost. On the fifth day, they encountered the Kraken. Tentacles emerged from the water 30 yards off the starboard side, thick as tree trunks, covered with suction cups the size of a plate. Soyeon fired one shell, right at the base of the nearest tentacle. The Kraken twitched. It dove into the depths. It didn't return. Hannah recorded the coordinates, the time, the depth, the reaction. She kept a log of encounters with the deep ones, the first of its kind in the world. On the seventh day, they found a piece of wreckage. It was drifting on the surface, a piece of the magical ship's hull, coral plating, dead, gray, no glow. Dan ordered it brought on board. Soyeon examined it. She found a structure inside, metal, not steel, made of an unknown alloy, a cylinder with holes. Inside the cylinder was a mechanism, primitive but functional, a spring, a small hammer, a lever. When rotated, the cylinder emitted a sound of a specific frequency. That very one, the one that awakened the deep ones. Dan looked at the device. Soyeon looked beside him. She had seen such devices in the Khanate, but this one was different, better made, from a different metal, with a hallmark. The hallmark was imperial, the coat of arms of Valacine, and a personal seal, a crown with 3 points, the Emperor's seal. Soyeon said quietly, "So this comes from above, from the very top." Dan nodded. They crossed the ocean on the 11th day. They reached the eastern shore, land that no one from the western coast had seen in 30 years, ever since the last magical fleet had made the transoceanic voyage. People lived on the eastern shore, just like those on the western shore, hungry, frightened, cut off from the world. They stared at the steel ship with its smokestack and couldn't believe their eyes. The Mayflower returned to Harrogate 26 days later. When it entered the bay, the entire town was gathered on the shore. They knew it had left. They didn't know if it would return. It returned, safe and sound, with a full crew, with a cargo of eastern spices that hadn't been seen in the West for decades. Abby sold the spices for a sum that exceeded the town's annual budget. She sat in the office. She looked at the numbers. Then she looked up at Dan. She said they were rich. Dan shook his head. He said they were free. Those are two different things. After the voyage, events accelerated. Salt sent a pigeon, a short message. He'd found out. The Emperor had been dead for 8 years. An avatar sat on the throne, a creature from the depths. It had struck a deal with an abyssal cult. The cult receives sacrifices through the perishing magical fleets. The avatar gains power over the land. The sea priestesses are ritual sacrifices in slow motion. The empire feeds its people to the deep ones to hold on to a throne that has long ceased to belong to a human. Dan read the message. He passed it to May. May passed it on to Soyeon. Soyeon passed it on to Clarissa. Clarissa read it and, for the first time in front of everyone, cursed. One word, short, pithy. Everyone looked at her. She said that her father, Admiral Ashton Vale, served that creature. He was sending people to their deaths on the orders of a being from the ocean floor. Her voice was steady. Her hands didn't tremble. the steel-like fingers of her left hand clenched into a fist. Then they unclenched, clenched again. She said that if they had to go to the capital, she would go first. Dan said they would all go, but not in the gunboats. He'd spent 2 months preparing. The second battleship was finished. They named it Oscar. The old man heard the name and went to his quarters. He returned an hour later. He said nothing, but his eyes were red. They laid the keel for the third ship, small, fast, a reconnaissance vessel. Soyeon named it Iskra. Salt worked from the inside. His agents in the capital were gathering evidence, names, dates, documents, and chains of command leading from the throne to the underwater temples. The mark on the device Mayflower found became the key piece of evidence, the dead emperor's personal seal on a weapon manufactured after his death. That meant whoever was sitting on the throne was using the seal, not the heir, an imposter. Dan led the fleet to the capital. 2 battleships, the Mayflower and the Oscar, 120 men on board, not an army, crews, engineers, workers, people who knew how to build, not kill. They approached the capital from the sea. They anchored in the roadstead. Dan did not open fire. Instead, he sent documents ashore, through Salt, through his people at the Admiralty, through newspapers not yet controlled by the court. The documents spread throughout the capital in a single day. Correspondence, blueprints of devices, the mark on the cylinder, Soyeon's testimony, maps of the Deep One's routes matching those of the magical fleets. Victims who were not chosen at random. The city exploded. Not with cannons, with words. Salt led the guard, not the Imperial Guard, but the Port Guard, the City Guard, veterans of the magical fleet and the widows of fallen sailors. They entered the palace. The Avatar offered no resistance. He could not. Far from the water, he was weak. His power lay in the sea, in his connection with the Deep Ones, and the Deep Ones could not sense the steel ships anchored in the roadstead. For the first time in 1,000 years, the connection was severed. The Avatar turned out to be what he truly was, a shell, empty, gray, smelling of sea salt and rotten coral. They carried him out of the throne room on a stretcher. Clarissa stood by the door, watching, her steel hand clenched into a fist, her face stony, her eyes dry. Then she turned and walked toward her father, Admiral Ashton Vale, who was standing against the wall, old, crushed, having realized he'd served a dead man for 20 years. Clarissa approached him. She raised her left hand, her steel fingers unfolded. She held out her palm to him. Her father looked at the mechanical hand, at the joints, at the cables, at the daughter he had exiled, who had returned. With an iron hand and a steel fleet, he took her hand, with both palms, and wept. The old admiral wept like a child. Clarissa stood there, holding him. She didn't cry. She had already cried her fill, in the back room, a long time ago. Dan didn't see that. He was on the ship, in the engine room, by the boiler, checking the pressure, listening to the engine run. May came down to him, told him it was all over, that the Avatar had been arrested, that Salt was in control of the palace, that the devices for awakening the Deep Ones had been destroyed, every single one, all along the coast. Dan nodded. He asked about the Deep Ones. May said that Naya said they were fading away, slowly, like an echo. Without the devices that wake them, they'll fall asleep again. Not right away, maybe a year, maybe 5, but they'll fall asleep. Dan sat on a crate by the boiler. He looked at the pressure gauge. The needle was stuck at 4 atmospheres, exactly, steady. He placed his palm on the warm side of the boiler. He said quietly, "Well, there you go, sweetheart. We made it." May stood nearby. She looked at him. Then she sat down next to him on the crate, shoulder to shoulder, in silence. They sat like that until the boiler cooled down. Then they went up on deck. Evening, sunset. The capital was ablaze with lights, not from a fire, but from street lamps. People had come out onto the waterfront, gazing at the 2 steel ships in the roadstead, at their smokestacks, at their flags. Harrogate, a free city. Everyone was standing on the deck of the Mayflower. May, Soyeon, Clarissa, Naya, Hannah, Abby. Each in her own place, each where she was supposed to be. Dan stood at the rail. He looked at the water. The ocean was quiet, dark, calm. No green glow, no voices, just water. He knew there was no way home. He'd learned that 6 months ago, when he found records in the capital's library about 2 other time travelers, a Chinese monk, a Russian female doctor. Both had stayed, both had lived out their lives here. The world had drawn them in like an antidote and closed the door behind them. Dan was the third, and the last, because after him, the mechanism would shut down. It wasn't needed anymore. The world had learned on its own. He stood at the rail and thought about the letter to his daughter, about the 3rd paragraph he hadn't finished writing, about how proud he was of her. He'll never finish it. But maybe she knows. Maybe she's always known. May came over, stood beside him, didn't speak, just stood there. Then she handed him a mug. Tea, bitter, with salt, local. He took the mug with his steel-hard fingers that had built boilers, forged ship's bolts, and drawn the blueprints for ships this world had never seen. He took a sip. He looked at May, at Soyeon, who was smoking by the stern gun and gazing at the stars, at Clarissa, who was standing on the ditch with a spyglass and a steel hand, at Naya, who for the first time in years was standing on deck at night and didn't hear a single voice from the depths, at Hannah, who was sitting on a rope coil and counting the stars, literally counting them. She was recording coordinates. She was drawing up a star chart, the world's first accurate star chart, because she could. At Abby, who was standing by the gangway with the ledger, recording the berthing fees in the capital's port, because even after saving the world, someone has to keep the books. Dan finished his tea. He set the mug on the deck. He looked out at the ocean, calm, free, belonging to humans for the first time in 1,000 years. He spoke softly, so only May could hear. He said that home was here now. May didn't say anything, but her hand rested next to his on the deck, without touching, just next to it. In the morning they'll weigh anchor. They'll head back to Harrogate, where the unfinished 3rd ship awaits, and the 4th, still in the planning stages, and the school where children learn to read blueprints, and the blast furnace that never goes out, and old Oscar, who comes to the shipyard every morning and places his hand on the warm hull of the ship that bears his name, and Grant, who has already taught 12 apprentices to hear the ring of proper steel, and Thomas, who limps but walks straight because foremen walk straight, and Finn, who returned to the shipyard with a cane in one hand and a hammer in the other. Dan Crow died in 9 seconds at the Newport News shipyard, and he was reborn into a world that smelled of salt and hot metal. He didn't build a road home. He built a home, out of steel, out of steam, out of people who believed they were capable of more than they were told, out of rivets, each one driven in for a specific name, for a specific face, for a specific life. He didn't slay a dragon with a sword. He built a world where dragons fall asleep because there's no one left to wake them. And that was enough.